Are you ready?
Wait, Dom and Johnny?
Yeah.
Okay.
3, 2, 1. Dom and Johnny in the morning! So I figured we could start with a follow-up from last time because Ian asked John, you asked why Tom trains in the martial arts, and then you didn't really give a complete answer. How very masterly of me. So Ian said, you mentioned that the reason you still train in the martial arts is because you live an integrated lifestyle, but why is teaching fulfilling? That is a good question, right? And my answer is, I think, just as dodgy, which is, I don't know why, I just know. Which is kind of why I talked about digital media and design last time, because, basically I tried a bunch of things, and this was the thing I landed on after trying a bunch. So there's not really a causal explanation. It's just something that just seems to check all the boxes in a pretty nice way. I will say that one of the unique things about the martial arts is the physicality of it. I think that when I was a professional dungeon master, for D&D, the thing that I found would make it difficult is the fact that there wasn't a movement component. So I would be happy playing for a certain amount of time, but I don't think I could do it as a kind of 9 to 5 job 5 days a week.
No. Yeah, I did the desk job thing. I can't do it.
That's
too long in a chair.
Yeah. No, and I do joke to the parents that I do kind of work weenie hours because it's on average I think it's less than 4 hours a day. So, but that's when I'm here. I do stuff at home and everything. But yeah, so that was why I continue to train in the martial arts is it helps me move and it helps check off all the boxes of things that I find fulfilling. I don't know why I find them fulfilling, but...
Oh, that was a first caller question.
Yeah!
I mean, it's not really a caller. Did he call you?
No, he texted me.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well, still pretty cool.
Yeah, if you have any questions, by the way, listener people, feel free to ask, and we'll see if we can answer them on the pod. So today's thing that I wanted to ask you, because this is because of you, last time, you've got a 4th degree black belt in Shaolin Kempo Karate, a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You've also dabbled in other martial arts, you've done Kung Fu, you've done boxing. And one of the things I thought that was really interesting that you said is the more you've looked at other styles, the more you've grown to appreciate Shaolin Kempo Karate as a system and its merits. So I was just wondering if you could crystallize that at all. What are the merits of Shaolin Kempo Karate? Not necessarily in contrast to other systems, but if it does do some things that are special, that'd be kind of interesting.
Yeah. Well, so as an impressionable youth, and by an impressionable youth, I mean in my young 20s, because I took a long time to mature, I found myself, kind of questioning. I know I mentioned last time that I had started for very physical reasons, which led me to want to make sure that I was in a very, well-respected style, because I didn't, I valued the opinions of others way more than being able to look inside and think about how I thought. And if you ever want to go on this spiral of self-loathing, you could just go on any forum and, type in, Shaolin Kempo Karate or whatever art. And that was what took me a long time, is to figure out that, it doesn't matter what style it is. If you look it up online, people are ruthless. So if you train in traditional karate, you have this whole sect that just bashes it for a living.
Yeah.
And then if you like the modern styles like Muay Thai or BJJ, you have this whole other sect that lives their life just trashing it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what you do. So what I was doing was I was going on and searching my martial art and seeing people trash it and be like, wow. I was like, I am training in a style that everyone trashes. Not willing to take a look and realize that people just enjoy trashing things.
Yeah.
So it made me want to cross-train. And the more I cross-trained, the more I realized how valuable this system was. And this is my young mind, from a fight perspective.
Yep.
Which was at that point what was the most important thing to me. I hadn't yet really experienced the true benefits of the system, which is why I ended up staying for so long. Because it doesn't take that long to learn how to punch and kick somebody.
Yeah.
I think it was Bruce Lee that said, take a boxer that knows how to wrestle, and I'll show you the most dangerous man on earth.
Yeah.
And really that's what it is. To be a competent fighter, it doesn't take a lot of effort, but to be a disciplined fighter and to grow in your character, that's the lifelong study. So the more I cross-trained through Kung Fu and boxing and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the more I started to see, how much of that, A, is already in Shaolin Kempo.
Yep.
And B, how fascinated some of the people that I worked with were about the stuff I was doing.
Yeah.
Because it bridges that gap. Mm-hmm. You have all these, you're on the circumference of the circle. Did I use that term correctly? That's the outside, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Listen, I didn't say I excelled in school. So you're on the outside of this circle, with all these styles, and then you have our style, which kind of acts as that, intermediary point in the middle. And a lot of the Kempo styles kind of live in that realm. But that's what really made me truly appreciate this style from a self-defense and fight perspective. And then all the other stuff that I, really started to learn as I got a little bit older and matured a little bit and realized how much it was affecting my life. That it wasn't even the cherry on top of the awesome sundae. That ended up being the awesome sundae.
Yeah, yeah.
And then that self-defense, morphed into the cherry at the top.
Yeah.
So that was my long-winded explanation of my experience.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because that, you've been talking to Kempo practitioners. That is, from my understanding, one of the principles of Kempo is the idea that it shouldn't be this static tradition that you just do because you've always done it. You take a look at what works and integrate principles from a lot of different styles so that situationally you can be effective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of like being a Sith Lord, So
do go on.
So your master teaches you, all they know, and then eventually you take them out and, adjust it to fit, your needs, except on the light side of the force, not the dark side.
Sometimes you have to accelerate that death of the mentor step of the hero's journey, huh?
And the beauty of our style is instead of having to, take out your mentor, the majority of the mentors in this system are fostering that individual growth, which is such a cool thing when you see how many practitioners, take their students and just want replicas of themselves.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I do want to go back 4 steps because to the criticism point, I do think having read some of the criticism, contextually some of it is fair because any art, a lot of the quality of the training and the teaching has to do with the teacher. Mm-hmm. So if, say you had somebody who, started the art and then broke away or something and started their own Shaolin Kempo school, I could very easily see how a lot of the techniques and stuff could either get watered down or taught improperly, or there's something that an individual teacher says works, where it's nah. And of course, part of it too is that this is, especially for us in our professional careers, a lot of times we teach children. And one of the considerations is, not lie to them, but how do you veil some of the realities of fighting until they're mature enough to be able to handle it, right? Mm-hmm. So a lot of times for our 5 and 6 year olds, we talk more about heights than targets, because we want to make sure that they can identify a situation for the more aggressive tools, right, or the more intense tools. Mm-hmm. The reality is most of the time in my area, very personally, Like, that's not usually the concern. A lot of it is more like the social emotional stuff. And of course, the few times there is like a physical issue, well, now we can address that kind of specifically. But I could see how if you only had gotten the veiled understanding, why you could kind of build a fantasy that things act like way more effectively than they do sometimes. So yeah, I do think that because I think it's a pretty complex art and it's very curriculum heavy. It could take someone a long time to really appreciate all of like the things going on behind the curtain. Whereas other arts that are a little more focused, but maybe not as complex, and by complex I mean curriculum heavy, it would be easier to maybe see the translation of like, this is the teaching to this is how it works.
Yeah, I agree with that on so many levels.
Yeah.
And I think you see that, especially with really high ranks trying to teach really low ranks, because there is that very specific progression.
Yeah.
You know, and depending on where you are in the journey, the art looks so different because it has to. It is such a complex, with so many subtleties, that if you try and teach a white belt to, you know, like you would teach a master, you know, there's so much lost in that translation that they not only can't defend themselves under the, you know, 0.005% chance that they ever will get in a fight, but they will probably take longer to reach that mastery point, just because they'll find so little success in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I feel like the way we're structured is so that you can have so much success from the beginning. And I think that's where a lot of these people that branch off, you know, they have their own opinions, and at this point they're either out at a position where they just have no idea how to teach kids, or younger ranks, and they forget how they were taught when they were younger ranks. And I think that could throw off quality for sure. You know, I think Master Ken used to talk about, you know, the Kung Fu practitioner versus the karate practitioner.
Yes. Yeah, sometimes he still does.
Yeah. So, you know, the first 10 years, you know, the karate man going to wipe the floor with the Kung Fu man. But, you know, if the Kung Fu practitioner is really working their craft, then after that 10 years, things start to change, because things that become all about intense timing and just, I don't even know how to explain it, sense of touch, you know, things like that, that take years and years and years to develop. All of a sudden, those skills start developing, and now karate guy, you know, Kung Fu guy is giving karate guy more of a run for his money.
Right.
You know, so.
Well, it is interesting because Shaolin Kempo Karate, like the name comes from the progression and the utilization of those three styles, which, and it's funny you say 10 years, because if you look at least our school, because every school sometimes has a different timeline or whatever, the first Shaolin form that you learn where you really start working it usually comes at about the 8 to 10 year mark. So it's just interesting how that timeline kind of matches up, where and it's really difficult for a lot of people who find success with the more structured karate techniques. You know, when they're like a green or a brown belt, maybe they're doing tournaments or competing in sparring, and they get a lot of success, all of a sudden having to smooth out and soften a lot of their movements and really pay attention to what their spine is doing as opposed to their limbs. It can be a really jarring transition if there's not a bridge for it. And yeah, it's one of the things that I think is interesting is it's really hard to just break things down to their component parts. A real good example is my mom is teaching Tai Chi right now. And she was asking me about how to help students who don't train martial arts, how to figure out where their spine is at. And I think it's funny to begin with, because a lot of martial artists don't really have an understanding of how that works. But one of the things that was interesting is she was thinking about how she learned it And even that was like way far ahead of where a lot of her students are. So it's really hard to go back to just gross motor. Like start with gross motor, and then one Lego piece at a time, you can start adding in the fine motor. But it's gonna take a while, and it's gonna take patience just for the neurology to catch up to what the body's able to do.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I see students a lot of times, and you'll see them, maybe the push and pull's not right, and it in your head, like something mentally is breaking.
Yeah.
And you wanna touch on it, but at the same time you can see that their stance needs work first.
Right.
And so you have to bite your tongue, and you're like, I need to get that stance right before I can start delving into the push and pull. And it's just making sure you're stacking it in the correct order.
Yep.
And trying to get those big gross motor things first. Even if the other things you really want to make that correction, and you really want to lay as much on a student as possible, you got to remember that these kids, especially kids, they can only handle so much at a time, because most of these kids aren't going home and practicing, and that's okay. We don't expect them to, that's the life of being a kid, so they see us once, twice, some of the diehards maybe 3 times a week, and if they have 10 things to focus on, odds are they're going to come back having improved on none. But if they have 1 or 2 things, then there's a much better chance of them coming back and saying, look at my stance, look what I did, and they get all excited. And then you say, great, now let's focus on that push and pull,
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's just kind of interesting as you're talking it through is a lot of times I think teachers get caught with the assumption that just because they've learned it means that they'll remember it. And what I mean by that is, like, you've got, let's say, a 7-year-old white belt, and by orange belt, their stances look really strong. And, purple belt, blue belt, it's fine. Suddenly, they're a green belt, and their stances are all upright, and their feet aren't in the right position anymore because they hit a growth spurt. So essentially, they have to, like, relearn all the lessons that they had already done in order to fit their new body. And then it happens again at brown belt, when they start hitting puberty. And then it happens again for adulthood, like as things tighten up. And what's fascinating is you almost have to keep going back to gross motor, because you have to it's almost like a software update. Like you have to keep like rebooting them every time they hit a certain milestone in their life. And I wonder how often teachers forget to pay attention to that, and they just assume I already said it to them, so I can keep on building.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm guilty of that. I started at 15, and I had grown as much as I was going to grow at that point. So I never really got that experience. So it's not something that's usually at the forefront of my mind, and something that I have to remind myself a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that 15 to 20 year age range, those guys have it, I swear, the easiest. I feel like I had it pretty easy because I didn't have to worry about my body changing all that much at that point. But I hadn't gotten to that point where my hips are starting to stiffen up, that you start to see as you get close to 30. So that's definitely something I have to remind myself often.
Yeah, and I also wonder if that's just another benefit of the style, is that it kind of grows up with you. Where when you're a kid, like assuming you start as a kid, the harder arts serve to give you structure, to learn how to move in your own body. But as you get older and the art softens, your body, what it needs is to soften with it.
I'll tell you what, my body has definitely softened over the years.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you have to fight harder and harder to not. Yeah, but yeah. So the other thing I wanted to ask you, having just seen and been exposed to a lot of like Kempo, is just how Shaolin Kempo karate differs from like a pure Kempo art.
That's a hard question. The pure Kempo art is a tough thing to define, and I feel like whoever you ask will have a different answer. I think most people would say, true Hawaiian Kempo, back from William Chow, would be, the origin, like the true pure Kempo, unless you're talking about more of the Okinawan Kempo, which I think resembled much more of a hard karate.
Yeah.
So if we're talking about like just modern Kempo in general, I think we focus more on the power side of things. So I absolutely adore I almost want to call it like a mathematical process or a scientific process of American Kempo. It's everything is calculated, and they think on a completely different level where they're always thinking about where your body needs to check your opponent's next movement. So it ends up
kind of like a chess match.
Yeah. So it's really cool, and I think there's a lot of benefits to thinking that way.
Yep.
I've always enjoyed our style because I think it has more emphasis on, doing what you need to do quickly.
Right.
So there's we're not as focused on this into this into this into this. Most of our techniques are designed to drop our opponents with a couple movements. So with the exception of 11 combination, where after you're done, your opponent's been thoroughly stomped.
Right.
Most of our combinations are really simple, quick, and effective. And I think that's what I really like about it, especially when you start trying to implement it into more of a controlled free sparring, where you're trying to spar, not like in a point sparring sense, but spar as a in a fight sense. I feel like it's easy to incorporate those techniques and utilize them. I don't know if I actually gave you an answer.
No, I think you did.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say either one. I don't think I could ever say either one's better. It's just two very different ways of thinking.
Yeah, so I'm more curious because I haven't had as much exposure to, I guess, American Kempo. Because I know Kempo is kind of like, that's a very loaded term, and that's a big umbrella to try to, like, reduce it into universal concepts or whatever. So I more meant the Kempo you've kind of looked at the most, which sounds like American Kempo.
Yeah. My uncle was a practitioner, and he got up to second degree black belt. And that was, back in the 70s, that was no joke.
Right.
So that took years and years of training, and then most of them, when they got to first or second degree, they had no desire to ever rank up. So it was their goal to never have to, because their curriculum spanned from white to black. That was it. Okay. After black belt, there was no more curriculum to learn. It was all refinement.
So was it just that the testing was too demanding to rank up, or was it?
No, it was like a pride thing.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know.
That's kind of interesting, yeah.
It was, and I don't even think it's the same way in those Kempo circles these days, I think. But back in his day, at least, there was, with his group that he was in, they thought to themselves, I don't want more stripes on my belt.
Oh. Yeah.
So that's kind of where they were at. So most of my Kempo information comes from him, and then I do spend some time in the Kempo circles out here, in a couple different places, and it's good to have camaraderie, because even though our styles are different, we come from the same tree.
Yeah.
And so it's cool. I will always promote meeting and training with other martial artists.
Yeah.
Can't be said enough. If the physical side of the martial arts is one of your focuses.
Right.
So, a lot of people train for a lot of different reasons. Some people train just because they love that community that we have.
Yeah.
And all of my friends are here, so I get that, but for those that really love the martial side of it, meeting people outside of your school or outside of your system, I don't think you can get any better benefit, because it changes the way you think about your style.
Yeah.
all of a sudden you do your combinations on someone. I worked with a Shuri-Ryu black belt, and doing my techniques on him were different because he reacted to them differently.
Right.
One, because he didn't know them. So we get in this habit of moving for our partners, and it's not because it's just natural. We know where our bodies are going to end up.
Yeah.
So we just naturally start to move for them, and it's very interesting when you start to do that on someone who has no idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
It changes the way you think about your techniques. It changes the way you do them, and I feel like it really helps boost your style. Because I feel like if you had gone and trained with the same people I trained with, you would have gotten different benefits. Just being bigger in stature than I am. So I think your techniques would have worked differently, and you would have discovered different things.
Well, and to just touch on maybe a positive quality of the whole, your partner moving for you, more from the partner moving for you's perspective, like the puncher and or attacker type person. Like, the one thing you are learning when you do that is not only how to protect yourself, but also counterfighting.
Oh, absolutely.
Because if you know what technique is coming, and you have a sense of where, like, say, like a kick is going to go, or a strike, or a lock or something, like, you're learning how to yield to it so you can turn it into future success. Like, there is a positive, like, it's always a question that I think is interesting when it comes up, because it's like, oh, well, of course it works because the person knows what's going to happen to them, so they beat themselves up, like that episode of SpongeBob where, Patrick beats himself up so that SpongeBob can go to the salty spittoon. Like, there is that element if you're not paying attention, but if, both parties are conscientious of it, there is a positive quality that can be derived from it as well. And also, it's good to know if it would work by training with someone that doesn't know what's going to happen. It was funny. My sister actually, I think before her 4th degree test, had her then fiance, now husband, punch in for her, who literally had no training, because she wanted to know if she was doing it, would it work? And for the most part, it did, pretty consistently.
Yeah. And especially in those situations, that's always fun. I've had my wife do that before.
Yeah.
She doesn't like doing it, but
right.
but I feel like the commitment to the punch is different. If someone doesn't want to hit you.
Yeah.
so if I'm like, Jackie, I just want to try something real quick, throw a punch at me. There's so little commitment in the punch that it's hard to be effective, because they're not actually trying to hit you. We tend to focus. We work with our partners all the time, and we discover a lot about ourselves. And we're like, oh, this works. This doesn't work. Why doesn't this work? Bring it to our teacher. Teacher informs us. We come back. We try it again. Okay, now it works. Great. And you get all this benefit from partner working, and then you try it on someone who has a completely different skill set, and all of a sudden there's a whole other list of things that you never calculated.
Yeah.
So working with BJJ practitioners is incredibly humbling, because it changes the way you think about grappling.
Yeah.
Because you think, well, from in close, I know how to hit in close, which
right.
is something that Fred Villari was big on.
Yeah.
Being able to hit in close quarters combat. And then all of a sudden you're working with a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner, and for some reason you can't move your arm,
right.
and they're so sticky that it's hard you can't get that punch in, because they always have their arms on you in a way where you can't hit.
Yeah.
So it now all of a sudden you have to figure out, how do I make this work?
Yeah.
And there's and there's ways and all. So then I go back to Master Ken. Say, Master Ken, this is where I failed.
Yeah.
How could I and like Master Fritz said, the goal is to fail as many times as you can, as often as possible.
To get back to the American Kempo question, because you mentioned the big differences, Shaolin Kempo karate techniques are just efficient and drop them as quickly as you can. And a lot of the Kempo stuff you've seen is more like a chess match. How much of like the Kempo, I guess, assumption is that you're fighting or defending yourself against someone who knows what they're doing versus someone who doesn't.
That is almost 100% from my understanding.
Yeah.
So Ed Parker always operated under the idea that you were fighting someone who knew how to fight.
Yeah.
So when you see some of his techniques, he'll be like, now, this is what you do when they put you in this position, a position that no normal person,
right?
Like this is like he's assuming that his partner is a fighter.
Yes.
And
which I know a lot of Shaolin Kempo karate practitioners also fall under that assumption. So I don't want to make it sound like they don't. I was more curious about the thing I know less about.
Yeah. His art is a well mapped out scientific puzzle.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the cool thing. And I think what my when I first started playing around and cross training a little bit, that was one of the things that dragged me to there, is because I like how easily they could describe things, because their terminology is so vast. They can just verbally, they can talk you through something. You could understand exactly how to hit.
Yeah.
And it's hard to explain until you start doing it and you hear all the things that they talk about. And Shaolin Kempo has it too. I just think that the terminology tends to vary from school to school. So we do the same things, but even things like attack line. I'll say attack line in other Shaolin Kempo schools, and sometimes they don't know what that is.
Yeah.
And it's not that they don't know what the attack line is, it's just the terminology isn't universal.
That is interesting, just trying to reconcile what you just said with things that Ken has also said as just like a merit of SKK, which is, especially we talked about, after that first 10 years, you start more getting into the Shaolin temple boxing stuff. One of the things that Ken says that makes it super difficult to teach is because it's about learning how the characteristics of your own body and maximizing your individual shape. So, and I can understand why, for the utility of having that more scientific approach of they do this so you do this, and also that, to me, there's a merit in not having it as strictly defined, where that's an option but not the only option, or not the only set of options, because there have been many times Ken's described, they come at you this way, most people would expect XYZ, but you can also make ABC work, and that's not something that they would have ever thought of. And that kind of very individualistic, naturalistic way of movement, I think, allows this art in particular to extend through a whole person's life beyond just like, the curriculum, so now you're just trying to be better at that curriculum.
Yeah.
I could be wrong about that, but yeah.
I could be wrong about a lot of the American Kempo stuff too, so.
Yeah, so obviously, like, if you came across this and you're hearing this and your face is beet red and you're just like, you guys are idiots! Like, feel free to correct anything we said. Again, this is just coming from a place of curiosity. But again, I think to talk more about the softer side of this art, because we've been talking more about the self-defense or fighting merits of it, I do think that this art, from my experience, one of the reasons you can train way into, your senior years with it is because there's health and wellness that's not just labeled health and wellness. So like training boxing will keep you healthy. It'll keep your cardio up. And there's a certain point you've taken enough shots in the head, you probably shouldn't box in the ring anymore.
Yeah.
Whereas with this art, I've found from my experience that part of the reason it's so easy to recommend is you can point out the physical health benefits even from white belt. So like 6 combination, I could see someone being critical of the fact that we cross our feet in the first stance, and learning how to move your hips so that you can catch yourself, even if there are certain preferences about how you'd fight with that, which I don't think is a bad thing. But like I can understand someone else's perspective of why you wouldn't want to do that. The other day I was just walking in my backyard and I slipped on a rock I didn't see, and I landed in that cross stance and was able to keep my balance and keep on moving. Being able to have the strength and stability and coordination to not wipe out, that's when you're 65, falling is your number one cause of mortality statistically.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Learning how not to do that, I think, is a huge health benefit.
I'm not worried about meeting a boxer on the street. I'm worried about the stairs.
Yeah. So, and I think that's the other thing is when you're looking at, protecting yourself from a probability perspective, it is really good to know how to fight. And like you said, basic self-defense, especially if the other person doesn't really know what they're doing, you can teach that in 45 minutes, and really it's up to the student's ability to drill it enough it becomes muscle memory. But the complexity of the curriculum, it also has all these like side benefits of health and wellness that it helps you move your body in weird ways so that when your body moves in a weird way unexpectedly, you don't blow your back out.
Yeah. And that's, I think, the beauty of, I think we're starting to be known as hybrid styles. I think that's the term that people have been using. And I think it's, I personally, this is me being biased. I personally think hybrid styles are the way to go. I think combat sports are really cool. I think they give you a huge understanding, and I think if you, especially at a young age, if you ever get a chance to try one, I think it's massively beneficial. But I do not think that is asking for a super long and healthy life. Being a Muay Thai fighter in the ring, having your shins, just destroying all the nerves in your shins, taking so many shots to the head, or something like Kyokushin, where people are doing like jump flying kicks into the side of your face.
Yeah.
Those are horrifically damaging.
Can you define the difference? Like, what are the categories? So you got hybrid styles, you've got combat sports,
and then traditional styles.
Those are like the three.
Yes, I would,
okay.
And I think most people consider us in the hybrid category.
Kind of sounds like it. Yeah.
We're traditional up to a point, but then we're not. You get to that point where we, like you said, we train our own essentially unique style in Shaolin Kempo karate because we all have different body types.
Yeah.
And we're training to be effective. So if something doesn't work for us, we change it to make it work for us. Unlike something like Shotokan karate or Goju-Ryu karate, where you do it how it's done.
Okay, so that would be like the difference between those two is traditional isn't necessarily how long-lived it is, it's how much you are expected to adhere to whatever tradition. So like if I made a style 5 years ago, and like whatever student came in, I'm like, this is how you do it, that would be a traditional martial art, even though...
in a sense, I would... I think this is where it gets a little gray.
Well, I think these are new terms, too, so they're just fun to discuss.
So, yeah, traditional style would be, you do it the way it's always been done.
Okay.
Typically, it's got more of an emphasis on the kata.
Okay.
So, and not to put down karate practitioners, because especially in the ring, they can be, like, old school karate practitioners.
Yep.
Those guys are brutal. They're scary dudes. They come in quick. But there's less of an emphasis on the holistic approach to the martial arts. So they do some grappling a little bit, but it's based in, the same techniques they've been doing. They have put a heavy emphasis on bunkai in their forms. But when you get into the hybrid styles, like we are, I think we're a stone throw away from traditional. We wear the gis, we bow before we enter the dojo, we do the traditional kata, we have the traditional
we do kata. I don't know if we necessarily do kata the same way it's always been done.
Well, yeah, that's the beauty of it, and we and then we train to fight. We train to fight in a combat almost in a combat environment. So we train the self-defense side, as being on the defensive, but then we train the offensive side too. And I think we do it in a way that bridges that gap between combat sport and traditional.
So what would be a combat sport?
So boxing's a combat sport.
Okay.
So you're in the ring. It's a sport. It's a martial art. It's a sport, but there are rules. You can't kick someone in boxing. But at the same time, switching hands with a boxer, or going head to head with a boxer, I mean, they're no joke. The reason why those guys are so dangerous is because they spend their life in the ring, and I feel like you cannot build enough reaction time to compete with one of those guys.
And like one of its characteristics would also be that it's competitive then.
Yeah.
Yeah, whereas, one of the famous things we say, especially to adults that are interested in training, is that this is not a competitive journey. There might be competition as an element, but that's not really the point. Whereas like it sounds like a combat sport, that is the point. You're getting in there to compete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see that in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu too. But you see it kind of two schools. You have like the school that's more of the combat sport, and then the school of thought that's more of the self-defense side, which would, be more kind of in the middle,
right?
Like us. So I think that would be my delineation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does sound like, even just from the sense that there are both traditional and combat sport elements in the same style, hybrid seems like a fair term to describe the fact that it fuses a little bit of a lot of different things.
We're not traditional, but we are a little bit. We're not a combat sport, but sometimes we are, so we're kind of right there in the center. And that's kind of where I like. And I feel like if you're on like the traditional side, I feel like traditional martial artists have a lot more of a healthy lifespan ahead of them. That's why you see, in Okinawa, these 80-year-old guys still teaching karate, out of their home dojo.
Right.
But then on the combat sports side, you see a lot of people that are getting, pretty messed up, by the time they're in their 60s.
Well, I think we touched a lot of the cornerstones of Shaolin Kempo Karate's merits in the martial arts space. Did you have any other final thoughts to wrap it up?
No. I'm pretty good at derailing conversations, so.
No, I think it was all on topic. At least, a sub-bullet point to a bullet point. It never completely left the Venn diagram. But yeah, I think one of the things that you said that I just want to re-emphasize, the community, I think, matters more than a style. So one of the reasons we've continued, actually this circles back full circle. One of the reasons I've continued to train here is just the community. There's a vibe to it. There's a history of excellence that I just love in this space. So I think that really if you can find a community, it like style, these are all just like micro points to the bigger reason why you would want to train in the martial arts or pick a particular style.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's why I'm here, the vibe. If I hated the class, I wouldn't have stayed.
Yeah.
All
right, cool. Well, again, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to comment to them or email us, or if you know me personally, just text me. And if you have anything you want us to cover in the future, let us know. Dom and Johnny in the morning!